everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. So a lot of things sort of stopped this year, but one of the things that didn't was me being a reader and a writer. And I sort of got to thinking what I learned about writing from every single book that I read this year, and that's what I want to talk about today. And I do mean every single book, so there's going to be some stuff in here like medieval texts that I read for class. The only things I left out were books that I have already talked about in a previous video on my channel, which I will link to those videos in the description. But other than that, every single book that I read this year, what I learned about it as a writer. For the sake of your time, I tried to keep it to one sentence, maybe two sentences per book. So let's get started. It'll be a bit of a whirlwind, so let's go. When you're using another language in a book, you don't need to fully translate or sort of cater to readers who don't speak the language. Rather, give some support, but cater to readers who will understand the language. A gripping world and a gripping concept is critical, but just as important is the effect that it has on the characters, because if your concept is interesting, your characters should reflect that in interesting ways. Like the whole series, this was a crash course on building a really expansive, broad universe, but also letting readers get really intimately familiar with the details and the nuances of the culture and the characters and the relationships. If you're writing a spin-off, readers are going to be really attached to the characters that they're familiar with. So give them a taste of that, but also take the mood and the tone and the themes in a different direction and sort of win them over with something new and different. As someone who was writing a fairy book, I learned a lot about how not to shy away from the sort of cold brutality of the fair folk, but also to be careful of the balance between a contemporary voice and more traditional folkloric content. If your character makes reckless decisions, and assuming you want them to be sympathetic, justify those decisions. Make it so that readers can understand and in the moment they feel like they would have made that same decision, even if objectively they can see that it's a really rash choice. Not so much a lesson, but a question that I've kept coming back to again and again, which is, as a marginalized writer or creator, can you participate in mainstream culture without perpetuating the harms of that culture? Start where the story starts, not where the backstory starts. Make the themes and the main questions clear for the reader, but explore them and dive into them in different ways throughout the book. Don't tread over the same territory again and again. Be aware of your audience. I think this might have been my bad as a reader, but I thought that this was definitely YA going into it, and it turned out to be more like new adult. And so I was taken aback by some of the ways that the author described and explored certain elements of the book. And that was a great reminder that just because you label your story as being for a certain audience, that's not enough to necessarily satisfy readers' expectations. This was a stunning example of how you can use really gorgeous, poetic language with a great deal of precision in a way that speaks to specific emotions and specific experiences, but simultaneously to broader themes. Even if you're writing the first book of a series as an introduction, make sure that you still have a satisfying arc and some conclusions within that first book. A really strong sense of place, of familiarity with a place, and of voice and of character and connections between characters will give you the space to explore plot elements that are ungrounded and things that are a little more ambiguous. Sometimes info dumping is necessary for world building, but make sure it's actually dumping info instead of just more words. If you're writing in first person, please do not have your character conceal something that they couldn't feasibly not think about throughout the course of the whole book. It's not a satisfying reveal. It just seems implausible that they would never have thought about it. One way to make a long and sort of expository story interesting is to draw on elements or figures that characters are already familiar with, to give them something to grasp onto amid this litany of unfamiliar events and terms. Despite the more recent trend towards very fleshed out magic systems with really clear rules, looser magic can still work really wonderfully if it's carried by a consistent atmosphere, like a feeling of the magic, and also by a good dose of humor. This was a super interesting example of how to write a myth for the present day, or even for the future, especially in the way that Lee writes a collective narrator alongside a protagonist who's simultaneously universal and individual. This was another lesson in balancing more traditional conceptions of the Fae with a more contemporary take. And in this case, setting readers' expectations really clearly so that they're not expecting something more traditional when what they're going to get is something much less traditional. One way to make a supposedly perfect character still flawed is by turning their flaw or their failure into something that is celebrated within the story and the world, basically shifting the rules of the world to make room for that character's flaws so that you don't wreck their aura of infallibility. There's that saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I sort of resist that because I'm, a writer, but I think that in this case it was really, really true because the parts that stuck with me from this graphic novel were the ones where I could see the impact, the very individual personal impact that Japanese internment had on George Takei and his family, and those parts were just as impactful as some much more graphic or violent or explicit written descriptions of Japanese internment that I've read. It's critical to really clearly establish a large cast of characters and a world that relies on unfamiliar technology and terms. Sometimes the plot or the cohesiveness of the plot doesn't matter as much as the characters and character dynamics if you have a really strong cast of characters. It's still really possible to have a pandemic book that doesn't feel too close to home as long as you use it to explore themes beyond literal sickness and survival. So things like gender identity, racial identity, capitalism in contemporary society. This book showed me how to write a twist ending without giving everything away too soon by dropping explicit hints, but rather by establishing a world where the characters and the setting and the atmosphere do the work of foreshadowing by showing that there's something going on. If you're creating a world, in this case a world of extreme wealth and privilege, just go for it. Dial it up to 11. But still be aware that if your characters are not sympathetic, even that really intriguing world that draws readers in might not be enough to make them stay invested in the book. This was a really amazing example of using unique formats for a reason. Basically setting up texts within the text that set up separate worlds but then come together in one story and one character. Chaotic magic systems work best if you have a few characters to focus on, but if you have a large cast with a lot of moving pieces, it can be helpful to set up some sort of central rules to the magic, a central social system, or a central location that readers can focus in on and come back to. Sometimes the shortest short stories, the ones that are snippets or moments or pieces of something bigger, are the ones that are going to stick with the reader rather than those that try to fit in a full plot arc within a relatively short space. You don't always have to be original in your concept, you just have to have an original spin on the characters, the relationships, the audience, or the tone and atmosphere of your story. Again, thinking about intersections between contemporary stories and folklore and mythology, this book was a great example of how to integrate pressing contemporary social issues and dynamics with a rich mythological background. This was a beautiful example of how you can establish a narrator who isn't really a presence as a character within the story, but is a really major presence as a force within the overall book and the structure. In sort of the opposite way as Call Down the Hawk, if you're writing a sequel rather than a spin-off that needs to have different characters or different setting, hold this book together with book one by keeping a really consistent atmosphere and mood, which readers hopefully loved about the first book. An object is just as good of a center point for a story as a person, especially if it becomes part of emotional relationships with different characters. Thinking about sequels again, it's a great idea to mix up the setting and make readers really think about what's going on outside of the more insular and expected world of book one. It can be so interesting to have a character who doesn't react or act in the ways that we would expect a human to. Just be sure to set up what's normal for them so that it's really meaningful when you go and break out of that. Give concrete forms and clear consequences to your magic, especially if your magic system relies on a lot of names and terms and history. Two things. One is making readers invested in secondary characters that really break your heart, and then writing climactic scenes that feel like a natural and inevitable extension of everything that's happened in the book. Oh, and one more thing, getting away with writing storylines that really should be two separate books, but that are so emotionally interconnected that you can get away with it. A lot of times I try to write antagonists that readers can really understand and even empathize with, but this book showed me that it can work really well as well to have an antagonist who's more of a force of nature, a mythological force, something that humans can't really understand as part of humanity, but rather more as sort of a force of chaos, almost from a myth. Don't shy away from writing a character who's cruel, who's uncaring, who's self-interested, even if they might be on the protagonist's side, and especially don't chicken out from following through with that character setup. It can work really well to keep one element or image of your story the same and then be constantly exploring iterations on it where the meaning is changed by the context. Don't use unusual formats just for the sake of unusual formats. Use them because they allow you to do something like making readers get invested in a character in a different way, or allowing you to break the rules of a traditional narrative structure without it feeling really unsatisfying. If you've got already a clearly established magical world, the last thing you want to do is make readers wonder, like, can this really happen? Inevitabilities make for a really gripping story. If you're writing a historical book or something that's a little more removed from our own world, it's not just the sort of vague universal themes that matter that'll make us feel connected to it, but also really specific events and feelings. Like, for example, the feeling of waiting for the results of an election, and when they come in, realizing that the people around you have chosen hatred and have told you and the people who you care about that you don't have a place. Another lesson for a shorter story, pick a central image or event, like childbirth in this case, and explore how its different facets can symbolize and speak to different elements of your story. So that is all the books that I've read in 2020. If you'd like to talk more about any of these books, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments. And I'd also love to hear about the books that you liked most in 2020 or those that you felt that you learned the most from. Thank you guys so much for watching. Happy New Year, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.